I wanted to start inking with traditional tools. Now, this whole picture is considered to be traditional. So when I say traditionally, I mean traditional tools that inkers have been using for many, many years. I don't use these tools anymore. I use more modern tools because it's really more the way that I work now. And I think it's a more portable, potentially much less messy way to work. All right, so we have our pencils finished. We have one panel that is going to be finished mostly with ink, and the rest are completely ready to go. They're fully penciled. All my detail is in, and it just needs to be inked. And for that, I have an upside down Series 7 Winsor Newton sable brush. And this is a very traditional tool that inkers use. It's a very, very good brush, and you can get an incredible amount of detail. And because it's a wider body, I can also get a decent amount of coverage. This is a nib holder. You can get these nibs separately. This one is Japanese. The American equivalent is essentially a Hunt mapping point number 102. That's a real classic. It's been used by inkers for, I don't know how long, a very long time. A very, very long time. And it's really the way that all of the inkers, when I started, used to ink. It's a much more effective way of inking finished pencils because the drawback of using a tool like this, and you can see that when I drag it across the page, the tips separate just a little bit, and that lets ink flow through onto the page. But if I try and go backwards, it will just scratch and I can't get a line out of it, and I can potentially get a spray that goes all over the page and it can create a real mess. I've done it a lot of times. The other thing that you need to be aware of is when you dip this pen, you want to make sure not to dip all the way up into the body of the pen. If you get ink in there, it will inevitably dump out onto the page. So I wanted to start inking with traditional tools, and for that I'm going to use my crow quill. So you have to be very careful when you dip it into your ink, and then do a couple of test strokes. And I'm just going to start to draw in the outline of my figures. And very quickly, because it scratches the surface, if you go over the same stroke too many times, it will actually pick up the paper and you'll end up with a little ball of paper at the tip of the pen, and it will start to dump more ink than you want. And so it takes quite a bit of control, but it's a very, very effective tool, and you'll get a more crisp line out of this than you can get with the tools that I use now. And I do think these are the superior tools to ink with. But the drawback is that it's very difficult to draw with these. And so I stopped using these in favor of more modern tools that allow me to scribble my line without worrying about my pen spray on the page. Another thing to be aware of, it's much easier for you to stroke a line along your hand than coming in this way. I work with my wrist and my arm along a path, and I can get a nice clean line that way. And this pen gives you a very nice thin to thick to thin. You can get a really, really thin, crisp line, and you can press harder and make it thicker, which is a real advantage over a pencil. It also makes it a little bit more complex to use. And I'll be able to do just about this whole face with this pen. And in so much as you can, the faster that you can throw a line with control, the better quality that line will be. But the more you do this, if you choose these tools, you'll just get naturally better at it. You'll develop more and more control. And it also depends just on your level of hand control in general. For me, I don't have the most subtle hand, and so I always find these to be a bit of a struggle. And hopefully you can also see, while I'm not having to do layout, I'm not having to do figure drawing in the same way. There is figure drawing in this. You need to be able to interpret, but a lot of problems are obviously eliminated if you're just inking. You don't have to worry about storytelling or a lot of the things that we discussed earlier on in the course. But inking does take more patience than penciling. You have to be cleaner with it. Each line is a little bit longer to pull. You need to be an artist to be an inker. I'm trying as much as I can to be faithful to the pencils and not lose the underlying shapes. And especially in faces, it's very easy with a subtle change to lose an expression or alter a face, and that's something you really want to avoid if you can help. Another disadvantage of using traditional tools like this is it lays a lot of ink down, and so it can take a while for it to dry on the page, and you'll end up having to move around all over the place waiting for your ink to dry. And if you don't, you'll end up putting your hand in it. That's another thing that I've done a million times, and it is no fun. This is not the way that I ink. It's very, very difficult. I like the effect that I can get from it for sure, but I just find that they can be very finicky, very difficult to transport, can very easily cause a mess, and are difficult to draw with. I'm going to leave some of these shadow shapes just open for now. I'm going to go back in with my brush in a moment and fill those in. It's a little easier than trying to scribble in shadows. And so there we have a figure drawn in with a quill, and we're going to start using a brush. I've got some ink loaded onto my brush, and I roll my brush so I can get a nice crisp point. So even though the body of the brush is fairly large, I can get a great deal of detail with that point. And I want to make sure that I have enough ink to cover, but not so much ink in the brush that I'll end up with overpowering lines. It happens very quickly and easily. And so we're going to go for it and see what we get. Inking with a brush requires that you press very, very lightly, because pressing hard with a brush will completely blow it out, and you'll end up with a much thicker line than you intended. An advantage of the brush, though, is I'm not outlining shapes in the same way. I can just brush them in and fill them as I go. But when I have finished pencils like this, I find a brush I can get a great deal of detail, and I really don't even need to use a quill generally, especially once I really get warmed up. But it is so subtle and so easy to overpower, I find it difficult to draw with. So if I'm doing inks over myself and I just have pencils that are like this, a brush is a very difficult way to go. And I tend to press fairly heavily when I pencil, so my pencils are very dark and it makes it easy for me to see what I need to do, and I'm really not losing the pencils under my ink. But some pencilers are very, very light with their hand, and it can be very easy to just completely lose a sense of where the pencils are, and they start to disappear under the ink, which is much darker on top. And so a good way to combat that is to print the page out first and keep it beside your finished piece while you're working, so you can refer to it if you start to get a little bit lost. And I'm just adjusting my pressure. This is like a wool kind of a hat, and so I want to get that kind of a textured line, so I'm not fighting it and I'm just throwing pressure onto the brush. I'm actually probably getting a little carried away. I'd be maybe a little reluctant to do this if this was someone else's pencils and I would really want to follow my shapes underlying much more closely. And I am trying to do that as much as I can. I don't want to alter my picture and just start to take over with ink. Very tempting to do that when I'm working on my own work. You can see I'm finding it a little bit difficult to not start just adding extra detail. And that's something you can get away with. If you work with a penciler for a long time and you have a relationship, you can get away with that. I shouldn't say get away with that. You're really adding to the underlying artwork, and it can really become a great combination of your skill and the penciler skill to make something that's better. But I want to, again, try to avoid that as much as possible, because I want to do a faithful reproduction of the pencils. It really is the number one job of the inker. Before you start looking at adding detail, changing textures, the penciler wants to know that the work that they put on the page is going to appear in the final work. And so there's going to be my second figure with a brush. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly fill in the dark shapes that I had on the first figure that I left open because I was using a quill. And this is an incredibly effective way to work. And, you know, there are great testimonials really just from the work of so many inkers that work this way, like Richard Friend, Scott Williams, Jonathan Glapian, Sandra Hope. It's a very long list of incredible inkers that use a brush approach. And then there are incredible inkers like Matt Banning that use more of a quill approach. Joe Weems is another inker who's absolutely amazing with a quill. And so I've got my figures inked in this panel, and I need to move on to the background and to the knife. All right, so I have a few options here. The first one is a flexible ruler. You can bend it to any shape that you want, and it has a beveled edge on one side that's raised specifically for inking, so you can run your tool along it, and ideally it won't bleed under it. Try and curve it so it fits pretty well to that shape. Let's see if we can do this with a brush. Let me just say, I don't recommend this. I think this is an incredibly difficult way to work. I'm going to try and run it just along my ruler here. And I got something, but that was a nightmare. That was very difficult, and I really would not recommend doing that. And so I'm going to move on to a quill. This time I think I will try and use a French curve and see if I can find something that'll give me the kind of curve that I want. I don't use these much, so this is a real fight. And I give up. Okay, we're going to go back to this. Because I have a bevel there, that should not cause problems for me. We'll see. And really the same holds true using a ruler. This one has a beveled edge, so when I rest it down, the edge rests down onto the page, or I can just flip it and then it gives me a raised edge, which is what I want. All right, so start to get my lines in. And I can add quite a bit of character to that line. It's a bit of a slow process, but I don't want it to look mechanical, so I want to increase and decrease my pressure, get something that looks nice and broken up and a little bit grungy. This isn't a new door, it's in an alley. I've got my ruler raised, so as I go over these lines, it's not touching. If I had my ruler flat and I was doing this, I would have spread ink everywhere already. This is taking me probably 4 times as long as it took me to just throw these in with a pencil and no ruler. But we're getting there. I'm going to use my quill to draw these eyes. With a brush that would have been very difficult. This is a really good approach to get kind of the benefit of both tools. Using a brush for things that are a little bigger, maybe a little broader. Using a quill when you're getting into very small details and when it would be incredibly difficult to get that with a brush. And all the while that I'm doing this, the hope is when I erase the pencils that I don't end up with something that looks a little disjointed and broken up, and that's very possible to happen. Pencils can kind of shore up inks visually until they're gone. So very often when you ink over finished pencils, you may find yourself erasing the pencils and then having to go in and doing touch-ups. And that's something that inkers do very regularly. So that's inking with traditional tools. And it is a very effective way to work. And if you can get comfortable with them, you can get incredible results. So we've got one panel finished, and we did that all traditionally, using traditional tools that inkers have been using for many, many years, and really the way that you would probably maybe want to consider working if you're working as an inker over someone else's work. I don't use these tools anymore. I use more modern tools because it's really more the way that I work now, and I think it's a more portable, potentially much less messy way to work. And so I'm going to start with my Micron. This is a Micron 01. It is the only Micron that I use. They have a whole range of sizes, and these tools are much more like drawing. So as a penciler for years and years, I find for me, it's more comfortable to work this way. And I find that most pencilers, by far and away, I wouldn't want to say all, but close, work in this way. Because I've got very small elements on these figures, I'm going to work with my 01. I never go smaller than this because this gives me a very small line, and I can throw these lines very, very quickly because I have no worry about pressure. Now, I don't want to press too hard because you can break the tip, but I can get the same thickness of line very quickly and easily, and I can throw this as quickly as I can throw a pencil. I can also go the other way with it. I can scribble with it, and it just gives me a lot more versatility. And so I'm going to go ahead and start to fill this in, and you'll see how much more quickly I can work using this tool. I just feel a lot more comfort with it. I'm just kind of getting the outline in. If I want a thicker line, it's very easy for me to just build it up and scribble it in just like with a pencil. I find no matter how much detail I can get with a pencil, I can absolutely get more detail in ink. And I have to be careful to not over detail and end up with something that gets a little muddy. That can certainly happen too. Even though Microns like this don't give you line weight, if you press very lightly, you still can get a bit of a thinner line, get a bit of a difference in thickness. So far, I've avoided the faces. They take a little bit more subtlety, so I'm kind of working my way up to them, just getting the rest of the figure in. I'll fill those in when I'm feeling really comfortable. Hopefully, this right here will really illustrate for you just why you need to be an artist to be an inker, because there is interpretation. I'm a pretty tight penciler, but there are still places like with this boot where things just really get lost. And you don't want to just start inking blobby shapes, and it's inevitable at times. Since you're not the penciler, and you don't always know what they were thinking at any given time, and you just can't tell what it is, it's not possible for every single little thing, every little time that happens, to call up on the phone and say, hey, what were you thinking with this little shape? Oftentimes the penciler actually really won't know. I've actually had that happen. I've had inkers call and say, what is going on here? What is this? And I've had to admit, I have no idea. It's just a shape. So you have to be able to kind of take those and interpret them into something. So now that we've got a few figures drawn in, I used my Micron 01 in order to get some really fine line detail. And so I'm going to switch now to a Tombow brush pen, and it is a hard tip. Hard tip doesn't mean with this pen that it's not flexible. It is flexible, but they also have a softer tip that will give you a greater deal of flexibility. I just find the softer tip is harder for me to control. This is much more like penciling, but it gives me a bit of a thicker line easier. I don't have to build it the way that I do with my Microns, and I can do a thin to thick without having to scumble my line. I'm going to work in a very similar way that I did with the brush, but I can work much faster and more comfortably. Not only am I never having to dip this, which is wonderful, but I just have more control over the line. It does not have the potential to give you the kind of line beauty that you can get from a brush though. And I'm getting a nice thin line from this when I need it, and that's because this is almost new, just out of the package. As these age, they start to blunt out quite a bit, and you can really struggle to get the detail that you want. And so I try to keep these fairly new, and I just change them out as they go. On the other hand, as these age, when they really start to age, they can start to dry, and you can get some incredible dry brush effects from them. Something you might want to give a try. Don't throw away these pens when they really go on you. Just keep them to the side, maybe put tape on them and label them so you know which ones are which, and you can use these for some really pretty textural effects. And if when you're using this kind of a pen, if you can't get that level of detail with your fur or your textures or your rendering, it's just time to switch out the pen. And it happens fairly quickly. I have a little bit of detail just on his back. I think I'm going to switch to my Micron. It's very small. I don't want to fight it with a pen that I need to be very careful with. So I try to get as much in as I can with the biggest tool that I can, just because I don't want to be here forever. But I try to be really quick to change my tools when it's more effective. It's going to be dark. I'll just use a brush for that, And it can be helpful just to quickly X in. It's pretty clear to me what I want dark here, but sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to tell, and putting a little X into an area that you want to darken is a good technique to use just to not get lost. And I'm using some of the sketchiness of my pencil. My line was bouncing around a little bit and just not being perfectly aligned, and just taking advantage of that and following some of those lines a little bit and cleaning it up a little, but trying to use it as a bit of a texture too. In inking, for me, it's a different approach, especially when I'm working over finished pencils. I just ink what's there. And so all the ink forms and rendering and little detail all at the same time, just in an area, as opposed to penciling, where I'm much more likely to block in my forms, block in my shadows, do everything in more of a systematic way. And before I move on, I'm going to quickly show you my brush. And this is the brush that I use now as opposed to the traditional brush that I was using earlier on. This is a synthetic tip, so it does not have the subtlety that I can get with the brush I was using earlier, but it has a huge advantage in not having an inkwell that I need to dip in that can dump over and cause me a lot of trouble. So I can just keep working and working with it. It never builds up so much ink that I make a mess, and it can go for a very long time without any worry about losing ink. And when it does, all you need to do is just squeeze the chamber a little bit and some ink will come down, and you can actually see it. It's clear. You can see it come into the chamber here, and it'll refill the brush. You need to be very careful though. If you squeeze too hard, you'll end up with a nice big blot of ink on your picture, so careful with that. And I'll be able to give this a pass afterwards. You can see I'm really not getting the subtlety that I'd really like from that, but I can go in with my other tools and clean that up. I have some whiskers here, and I left the little openings just to give them a little sense of light. I'm just going to ignore that now, and I'll use whiteout. Much easier way to do that than for me to try to work around something like that. This is coming along pretty well. I've got a whole lot established very, very quickly. And before we move on, I'm going to stop and we're going to draw in our panel borders. I'm going to use Copic Multiliner. It's essentially the same as my Microns. And you can see using these pens in a ruler is so much easier than using a quill, or especially using a brush. And I'm reasonably certain that no inker, no matter what tool they use predominantly, is ruling their panel borders with anything other than this kind of a tool. It's just so much more effective. All right, so now that I have that, it's going to make it much easier for me to finish this panel. I've got a nice line that I can work toward. I'm going to go back to my Tombow and start to fill in some of the small dark areas. And I'm adding some detail. It really tends to be easier for me to add detail with ink. I can get a little bit more textural in here. And this is where I find, especially when I'm inking, once I have enough established, I can see where I'm looking a little light and I can start to push and pull just a bit. And really, this is another big reason why I like using these tools, is I find it much easier for me to add detail and just start to take over a little bit and bring my picture to a better level than what I had it in the pencils. I'm going to take my thinner pen and start to finish the detail on my rats. Clean things up where it looks like it's a little bit harsh or stark in some of the contrasts. And you can see I can get a much finer line this way. And so much of penciling and inking is working with your relationships, your line width, your shadow, your rendering, and all these different skills to get something that sits nicely on the page and looks like it all fits together in a flowing environment. I'm going to use my same Tombow, flip my ruler. I find along a ruler, I tend to get a thinner line from it than I get just drawing with it, so I can go very far ruling with this, and it gives me the advantage of being able to get the kind of character that I can get from my line with the quill without the difficulties. I'm doing all my verticals first, and then I'll move into my horizontals, so I don't have to spin the page over and over again. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and switch to my Micron, and we're just going to finish this up. I have all my ruled lines in. They can end up looking a little disjointed and incomplete, and I find once I have enough ruling in, I can go in very easily and just freehand fill, and without it looking messy. That's just about it. I'm about ready to erase, and I really want to see just how much I missed, and erasing the pencils is the best way to really see just how well your inks hold together. So I'm going to start by erasing with my kneaded eraser, because my white eraser, it's a lot stronger and it can actually erase into the inks quite a bit. Something I'd like to avoid, so get as much pencil off with this eraser as possible. Much more gentle. It doesn't fade my inks anywhere near as badly. I'll just use a little bit of whiteout. I don't like that line there. Just to let you know, I'm using a Uniposca, and this is a paint pen. The advantage of these is that I can very easily go in and just subtract from my white with dark again. Some other whiteout, different types, will make it very difficult to work on top of. So I can put in some white very quickly. I can fix major mistakes with this stuff and then just touch it up with dark again. So we're on our last panel that we're going to ink. This one here, I'm going to be finishing mostly in ink, and it is by far and away my preferred method. It also has the added benefit of not having anywhere near as much pencil to erase. On all these, I have quite a bit of heavy drawn-in pencil, a lot of shadowing, and that's something I can deal with in Photoshop after I scan this in, but you really don't want to rely on that too much because you can actually affect the quality of the inks on the page. And so the way that I approach this is I don't really have my line weights established or anything like that. And I, generally speaking, do this stage actually in ink too. I don't usually have something quite as realized as this to work from, but I like to just get everything established in ink, so I use my thinner pen because that allows me to worry about line weights after I have everything worked in. So I'm just going to go through very, very quickly, just get this drawn in with ink. I'm not really being very careful because this tends to be a bit more of a push and pull process for me. When I'm working on finished pencils, I really need to be close to those pencils and try not to lose any subtlety that I had in the pencils, whereas really none of that's here, so I can just throw my line and just relax. And throwing my line faster with this pen, I just get a nicer line than if I'm trying to methodically follow something. It has a lot more zip to it. This is much more enjoyable for me because I'm just throwing lines and I'm not having to worry about closely following anything that's underneath. I'm following it because it's there, but if I choose to go in a totally different direction with a line or try something different, I can do it because nothing's really finished. And I'm putting down what will be more my final statement with these lines, so it's always a little more satisfying for me. So the next step for me is to just break out the brush. I just start with the areas that I want dark. And this is a different approach than starting with line weights, and it's an approach that can give you trouble if you're not as comfortable. I find starting with line weights and then moving into heavier shadow like this is an easier way to go in order to get comfortable, but this is a much faster approach for me, and it's something that I can throw in very, very quickly and then just clean up with my next layer. And I tend to use a lot more whiteout as a result of working this way, but my whiteout's pretty effective and it saves me a lot of time. And so I'm just throwing in shadows in the places where I really know it's going to be and I'm comfortable with it. And it's very easy for me to just throw in some shapes with my brush because I'm not trying to imitate anything below. And so in a lot of ways, inking like this is faster than penciling. Not entirely, and it is slower, but there are elements of it that work very, very quickly, and this is definitely one of them. And so that's going to establish my shadow for my other figure. And from here, I can use my Tombow and start to clean things up, get my line weights in, and get more of a finished picture. This ends up being a much less staged process. Kind of go back and forth, I'll render a little bit even, whatever feels right in the area that I'm working in. It's a very organic way to work compared to inking over finished pencil. You can see this approach lends itself to a much more gestural kind of a style too. And it's very different than what I did here, where things are a little more clean, and this will be considerably cleaner before I'm finished, but it ends up being a little bit more rendered, a little bit dirtier, which I like. It's not always ideal, but if I want to be much cleaner, I'll do a little bit more penciling on my figure just to avoid that. And this is definitely where whiteout starts to be much more important to me. I use it like an eraser and pull back where I put detail in, where I don't think it really works, where things get a little messy. It gives me a lot of ability to just think on the page. And because I'm doing this all in one shot and I don't have fully finished pencils, I'm not having to establish line weights for these twice. And so I can just go in with ink and get the kind of line thickness that I want without having to build it with pencil. And it really saves me a lot of time all the way through the background being able to do it this way. That said, I am still a slower artist inking myself than I am just penciling. If I was penciling this backdrop right now, I probably would already be finished all the way down and I'd be moving on. With ink, it's more slow and considered process, but then I get exactly what I want from the finished art. I really like to bevel my edges just by adding other little lines next to lines as much as possible, and it just adds a lot of believability and depth just doing that. And that's why I've got 2 lines here. I can go a little thicker with this one, maybe kind of bounce the line. It creates little kind of shadow catches in there like that, and it looks a lot more interesting and realistic than just very straight ruled lines. I'm not putting line weights in here. I never do, pencil or using a pen directly, because I like to get overall structure established like this. And then I can just go in, I'll recess that brick by shadowing above it, maybe this one beside it. This whole line, I'll just go a little darker and kind of bounce it. And I just want to get just using a little bit of line weight dimension in those bricks so they don't look like just a flat surface. And it doesn't take much to get that effect. So there's the bricks down here, and because I have the plaster over it, I can really frame my character. He doesn't have bricks intersecting with him all the way through and kind of confusing the issue. And I'm going to take my smaller pen and add a little bit of rendering to the buildings in the background, a bit of a fade up. I think that's going to basically do it. And that's how I draw in all of my detail just with ink to get a bit of a more gestural kind of approach than what I get here. And this is something that I personally prefer, and it's very tempting for me to want to go in and add more detail to this and kind of finish it out a little bit more like that first panel, but I'm going to leave it alone.
As always, if you want to follow along with me as we make our own comic page, head over to proko.com/comic page and sign up for the course. We'll have more lessons and go further in depth into what we've learned here, and we'll be posting new premium episodes regularly, so I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.